dear all, very warm welcome to this already fifth virtual panel in the World HandCOV'd series. The World HandCOV'd project is a cooperative endeavor by the Minsk Dialogue Council on International Relations and the Belarus office of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung. And as you know, throughout the project, we're trying to understand the longer-term implications of the COVID-19 pandemic for international security, and more specifically for security in the Euro-Atlantic and Eurasian spaces. And we're doing that by looking at what we call the pillars of international security. That is to say, some key states and international organizations that play this key role in the security realm. And today we're extremely excited to talk about the European Union. This has been one of the most awaited discussions, not only because of its topic, but also because of the absolute all-star cast for today. And I'm really very, very honored to welcome Prime Minister Kubilius, Dr. Arbatova, Dr. Hansbury, and of course, Mr. Dinsbeer. And at this note, let me pass it over to Mr. Jakub Wallenstein, the director of the Konrad Adenauer Belarus office, who is going to be our key moderator for today. So let's enjoy this discussion.
Thank you, Henny, for the introduction. And also from my side, welcome to all of you. I'm happy that you're joining us on this sunny and warm summer afternoon. As you said, the EU has been a part of our discussions over the last weeks already, being mentioned a few times in all of the sessions and being almost key in others of them. And today we're going to focus on the European Union. And we have, as you have said, an all-star panel. First of all, let me introduce to you Dr. Nadezhda Arbatova, who is joining us from Russia. She is the head of the Department for European Political Studies at the Primakov National Research Institute of World Economy and International Relations. She has been working for this institute for quite some time, but has also had some working experience at the Swedish National Defense College and the Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy. And her fields of expertise include European integration, EU-Russia relations, and European security. Secondly, Prime Minister Andris Kubilius, who is a member of the European Parliament for the Christian Democrats, a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and the chair of the delegation to the Euronest Parliament Assembly. He was the Prime Minister of Lithuania in 1999 to 2000, and again from 2008 to 2012. And he is the former head of his party, the Homeland Union, Tėvynės Sąjunga. Welcome to the two of you as experts. And as always, we have had two papers that I hope all of you have read. If not, I strongly recommend it that you read them. One of them was put forward by Dr. Paul Hansbury, who is joining us from the UK today, an associate fellow of the Minsk Dialogue, who received his doctorate at the St. Anthony's College at Oxford University on the topic of foreign policy of small countries, with a special focus on Belarus. And he is an expert on Eastern Europe in the broader sense, and also teaches on international relations and international security. And last but not least, my colleague Philip Dinsbeer, who was with us last week through his paper, which I then had the honor of introducing to you because he was not able to make it last week because he organized an important conference in Berlin. And today he is here to present the topic from another colleague, Alexander Beribes, who is the coordinator for European politics at the headquarters of Konrad Adenauer Stiftung in Berlin. And he is today in turn not able to be here with us. So I'm very happy to have you, Philip. Philip is the desk officer for transatlantic relations, and prior to this, he was my desk officer in Berlin for Eastern Europe, and also worked for Konrad Adenauer Stiftung in Jordan. So welcome to the four of you. Thank you very much for joining us today. And we will start the session, as always, with having the two experts present the main takeaways from their papers in 5 minutes each. And I suggest we start with you, Dr. Hansbury.
Thank you, Jakub. So my first thought when I was asked to write about strategic dilemmas facing the European Union was that I don't really think of the EU as a strategic actor. But I do recognise that this is an opportune moment to consider the EU, not least because responding to COVID-19 demands states working together and pooling resources. And if the EU is in any way strategic, then this is something that it will need to do now and at many times in future. So in the paper, I identify 3 strategic dilemmas that I think the EU faces in the coming decade. and which are highlighted by the pandemic, though I don't think that any of them is a direct result of the pandemic. I hesitate slightly in referring to them as dilemmas because, as you'll see, I don't think that the second one really is a dilemma. So the first dilemma concerns the issue of Germany's preponderant power within the bloc. And I stress that this is a structural issue rather than one of German policy. But I think there's going to be an increasing need to talk about the form Germany's power takes. After reunification, there were questions about whether or not we would see a European Germany or a German Europe. And that was a debate that was somewhat muted as the EU underwent various enlargement rounds into Central and Eastern Europe. But for various reasons, I think this is going to re-emerge more as an issue. In no small part, my own country has a role here because Brexit is partly to blame for this. But as well, when we look at the EU's proposed financial rescue package for dealing with COVID-19, we're reminded that Germany will carry a lot of the burden from the German taxpayer, and that Germany wields a lot of influence over the direction that these kinds of measures take. This also ties in with the long-running discussion about the US focusing more on the Asia-Pacific. Most recently, we've had talk about US withdrawing troops from Germany. So what will Germany and what will the EU do to feel secure? Will Germany remain primarily an economic actor, or will Germany be persuaded to invest more in its military? I've never held up much hope for the idea of an EU army, but that might be something that we will return to in the discussion. The second ostensible dilemma concerns the claim made repeatedly that the EU should involve itself more and take a lead in international affairs and multilateralism. On paper, there have been great strides in an EU common foreign and security policy. We now have a European External Action Service. There's now a European Defence Fund. And the EU is represented in its own right at many international tables. But in reality, for me, member states are not going to be willing to give the EU institutions the competencies required to be a genuinely autonomous actor internationally. When it comes to COVID-19, even within the EU's territory itself, one can question whether or not the EU is the most relevant actor. I was very interested to hear last week in the discussion about NATO as part of this series, that NATO is actively preparing plans for a second wave of the coronavirus pandemic. And since membership of these two organisations overlaps very considerably, it may be that NATO is the more natural institutional framework for marshalling the resources needed in the immediate term to respond to something like a pandemic. In any case, ambitions for an EU role in the world speaks very much to the third dilemma, which concerns about changing balance of power in the world. Many analysts have argued that COVID-19 has sped up a shift in relative power from the United States to China. While I would want to inject a note of caution there, and when people talk about a second wave, I would say it's a little bit too soon to say whether or not this is really driving a power shift or not. But China certainly came through the initial infections better than the US has. And I think the situation in the US is frankly a little alarming at the moment. So the dilemma for the EU here is finding itself piggy in the middle between these two rivals. On the one hand, it's great that the EU seems to be trying to take an independent position on China. Just recently, its High Representative Josep Borrell insisted that China wasn't a military threat to Europe. And I very much see this as part of his sort of ongoing efforts to put some distance between the EU's relationship with China and US-China relations. But on the other hand, the EU is going to be increasingly squeezed. And so to hold a position, it's vitally important that states work together, find agreed positions and stick with them so that they can support each other in this emergent world order. The risk otherwise is that they'll pull in different directions. And with some states keen to please the US and other states keen to protect developing trade ties with China. And it's easy to see how this will impede the EU's functioning as an actor. And I think that's the biggest dilemma facing the EU over the coming 5 to 10 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, for your introduction and the introductory words from your paper. And now, please let me hand it over to Philip to introduce the thoughts of Alexander Belarus.
Well, thank you very much, Jacob, and thanks a lot for having me on the panel, sort of as a delay to my scheduled appearance on the NATO panel of last week. As mentioned before, I am policy advisor for transatlantic relations, so NATO is my main focus rather than the European Union, which is more within the realm of expertise of my colleague Alexander Belarus, who's written the paper. So what I would try to do for this opening talk is to present the ideas that he has outlined in the paper, and sort of hold back a little bit with my own opinion on the issue for now. And I think when we're going into the discussion later on, there's going to be plenty of opportunity maybe for me to also voice that. But for the moment, I would focus on the key takeaways from Alexander's paper. And what he's doing in his paper, sort of on a meta level, before going into the details, I think he's trying to go into that dichotomy of, the initial response of the EU and, what sparked much of the criticism and the perception of disunity and of a sluggish response to the crisis. And on the other hand, the plenty of measures and different instruments that the EU has come up with since then, and that's probably and more likely going to shape, looking into the future of what the EU is, how the EU will react and will act in the context of the Corona crisis, but then also in more long-term developments. So as I said, he starts out with recognizing the obvious fact that at the beginning it seemed very much like the European Union was unable to act, and that there was a recession into national trajectories, with a huge disappointment, obviously, towards everyone who'd hoped for a more orchestrated and a more unified approach. And that was, of course, he also states that in the paper, and I think that's important to remember also when discussing this, has been amplified by disinformation and propaganda campaigns that, of course, try to exploit that appearance of disunity and would weave that into the narratives that were propagated online, but then also in other media. And we could discuss about what this did with public opinion and then how long-lasting that was maybe in the discussion later on. But so he acknowledges that fact at the outset of the paper. And then Alexander goes into sort of countering that impression by going over a range of different initiatives and instruments that the EU nevertheless has devised later on, that are more defining, I would say, of the approach it takes towards the COVID-19 crisis at the moment. And while acknowledging that, of course, the EU itself has limited competence in the sphere of public health, and main responsibilities still lie with member states, Alexander still acknowledges that there are instruments such as the Civil Protection Mechanism, the RescEU, the Coronavirus Response Investment Initiative, that the European Union has devised to counter the crisis, and that also within other frameworks such as the e-health network, where there has been much of efforts been focused on improving the interoperability between, for instance, different tracing and warning apps, that you could see that, through these instruments, the European Union is taking visible actions in the management of the crisis. And that, of course, also goes for the EU for Health program that has proposed from 2021 to 2027 a whole of 9.4 billion euros in response to the crisis. He connects that also with the instrument Next Generation EU that would support member states through another 750 billion euro package. The Franco-German initiative also has been mentioned before. All these financial instruments also, in some, he underlines, underscore that that willingness of Europe to overcome the crisis, and are very much sort of a different impression than what has been more defining in the beginning of that disunity, than now showing there's a unified approach, there's a concerted approach towards tackling the crisis. Maybe to make two more points, he also goes into, of course, the vulnerabilities that the corona crisis has uncovered, some of which have been mentioned in Dr. Hansberry's statement before as well. And he proposes, or he tries to make that argument that as looking into the conferences on the future of Europe that have been planned nevertheless, and that are designed as an open debate process involving citizens, he's advertising the idea that, you know, when looking at the vulnerabilities that have been uncovered and all these issues that we've been discussing, there are certainly lessons to be learned from the pandemic, which should be and could be discussed within that framework, which has this grassroots approach, because it does involve your citizens. And he underscores that this could be a very important avenue of reacting to the crisis as well. He concludes, and this would also be my last point, with a range of priorities that I would say show more of a continuity of the difficult and manifold challenges that the EU is facing these days, that haven't necessarily been altered or amplified through the corona crisis, but somehow, you know, will also be on the agenda with view, for instance, also to the German presidency of the EU Council, but then also for the longer term future. And this is, first of all, improving and continuing the neighborhood policy, especially with regards to eastern neighbors of the European Union, to intensify, this also has been mentioned before, European defense initiatives, to continue the engagement with Russia on the basis of the 5 principles mentioned by the former High Representative Mogherini. And last but not least, also something that has been mentioned before, to find a more unified approach towards China, but he cautions also towards India, and he underlines again that the German presidency of the Council of the EU had planned a summit on China in this regard that has to be postponed now, unfortunately, and that the Portuguese presidency is planning to have something similar with regards to India. So with that, I would close and once more would try to underline that he emphasizes there has been a unified approach by the EU later on in the crisis, and that the challenges of COVID-19 show actually that you know, what is needed in these times is more multilateralism, is more cooperation within the European Union, rather than less and more national state-based approaches. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Philip, for presenting Alexander's paper. You will be joining the discussion later, also with your own thoughts and your own expertise, but for so far, these were the thoughts of Alexander Papers. I would now like to hand it over to our two high-ranking experts to give a first comment on what you've heard, your own thoughts, departing from the arguments from our two authors. And I would like to start with you, Dr. Nadezhda Arbatova. Nadia, please, the floor is yours.
Я хотела бы сказать, что я прочитала обе презентации, и они чрезвычайно интересны. И хотела бы я начать с paper, который представил Александр, потому что...
I would like to start with the paper that Alexander started, because it is closer to my ideas and assessments. I was quite surprised when I read it, when I read the document, and I realized that we are thinking in the same manner. But I still have one little comment. I fully agree that the Euro-Atlantic relations will prove to be of huge importance to the EU, but we need to realize which Euro-Atlantic relations, because NATO, as an organization that we knew during the Cold time, during bipolarity world, is no longer there. It is a totally different organization, and the idea itself of strategic autonomy have grown out of a deep crisis which exists in the Euro-Atlantic relations. In other words, we can discuss, and a lot of words have been written about this, what these relations can be like, but the fact that they are needed is of absolute certitude. Now, the second paper, again, is very interesting. As they call it, thought-provoking in English. And I would like to start by saying that in order to decide on the strategic dilemmas that the European Union encounters, we must decide on the strategic goals and objectives of the EU. I believe that these tasks have received a fuller reflection in the Ursula von der Leyen's European Commission agenda. Some of the strategic bullet points are there, like the idea of strategic autonomy, the idea, in other words, which is directed at the attempt of the EU becoming a full-fledged hub of force capable of protecting European interests and values. And it is of special importance nowadays when, as Josep Borrell said, the world is moving away from the multilateral cooperation to a force-based politics organized around confrontation between Beijing and Washington, D.C. And the EU must learn the language of force to protect its own interests. Because of this, I have the first question. Can the strategic autonomy, as some people mention, can be achieved by intergovernmental method? We know still that the European integration has been developing through a flexible integration when we're talking about combination of federalist and intergovernmental approaches. I believe that the strategic autonomy, which requires establishment of extra political decision-making mechanism, material and technical basis, cannot be created through intergovernmental methods. The second question is related to the first one. It is the question about the role of Germany. It goes without saying that Germany plays a huge role in Europe. It is an economic superpower, and starting from July 1st, Germany is going to be to receive its presidency in the EU. But aside from this economic force that is focused on, it is important to understand what new ideas are going to be contributed by Germany to the EU, to the tandem, because along with France, Germany is the main motor of European integration. In that regard, it looks to me that Germany and France have traded places, whereas original goal, France was against supranational institutions, as you remember. Now it's the other way around. The German federalism, which used to be the basis of the European idea, is stepping aside. And now we see that it's other way around. It's Macron who wants more integration. He wants European Commission to exercise control over Eurozone. He wants more integration in foreign policy. At the same time, Germany doesn't want more supranational institutions. And yet another important question that many German scientists and thinkers are writing about, again, it's a dilemma, institutes and laws. For France, for instance, institutes are more important. For Germany, laws or legislation. And as one German scholar wrote, laws for Germany are turning into a sort of absolute norm, which has nothing in common neither with the reality nor with politics. So such ideas, especially in the field of integration, or what ideas are going to be contributed by Germany during its presidency, I think it is a very interesting topic to discuss. I don't know whether I went beyond the time given to me. I still have a few remarks to share with you. First, is the dilemma of solidarity. Paul was writing about the problem of democracy, the problem of consensus. I believe that we're talking about the dilemma of solidarity, and we need to understand why it's happening, why at certain moments in time supranational egoism takes over other ideas. And it's a very interesting question for the future of the EU. Liberalism as an elitist project of the owner, citizen, and democracy as a form of will showing of the majority in the mid-19th century have merged together and have shaped up a very appealing model of statehood, liberal democracy. Now, the current problems are coming from the fact that there is no longer a link between liberalism and democracy. And therefrom come the deficit of trust from the regular citizens to Brussels, to the national elites. And second important thing is that the liberal values, which are turned into absurdist ideas, are turning into their own contradictions. And the society is shirking away from them. So the solution I see here is to reestablish the connection between liberalism and democracy, the return connection between society and elites. And in conclusion, I agree with Paul that under the current circumstances, the EU cannot play the determining role. The European Union at the moment is an economic hub of force, but still, COVID pandemic, as strange as it sounds, opened a new opportunity window for Europe. On the one hand, we see a stronger bipolarity between Washington, D.C. and Beijing, which actually had existed even before pandemic. That was more latent before that, more diluted in polycentric world. Now it became more pronounced. But the paradox is that this bipolarity is going to be very special. It's going to have two weak or weakened force centers, which opens up new windows of opportunity to the EU to be more balanced between these two power centers which exist at the moment, which is China, United States, and Russia. And if they don't determine the global politics, then they can channel it in the direction appealing to them. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Nadia. And now the floor is yours, Prime Minister Kubilius, for your comments. If you agree, if I recognize your office correctly, you are in Brussels, so in the very heart of the European Union would be. Yeah. Looking forward to your observations.
Thanks a lot, Jakob. Really, I'm in Brussels. It looks like that we also are victims of climate change. Temperature is above 30 degrees, and so on and so on. So, but I will try very briefly, really have a very interesting comments. And of course, there is a big temptation to react immediately, but I will try to speak a few comments which I prepared before. As you mentioned, really we are talking about EU, post-COVID-19 crisis. My experience, I was 2 times prime minister, but on both occasions exactly during the crisis. So I have such a fortune, and I am not so, not so skeptical and not so negative about impacts of crisis. As big politicians are saying, don't waste a good crisis, and that is what EU needs to do. And here, of course, it's very important to remember what Jean Monnet have said back in 1950s. When he was talking about future of European community, he exactly said that Europe will be created during the crisis, and it will be some of everything what will be created during the crisis. So, and if to look into European history, really, from Rome Treaty to Lisbon Treaty, Europe was moving from one crisis to another crisis. And during each crisis, Europe was becoming more consolidated in one of the fields where it needed to overcome, that crisis. So if you remember the last crisis, financial crisis, global financial crisis of 2012, Europe came out with banking union. If you look into, crisis of refugees in 2015, Europe came out with, at least with Frontex. So that's my general view. Let's not be afraid of crisis. And if I would be, a real strong Euro federalist, I would say that, you need to enjoy when the crisis is coming to Europe, because that is how Europe is becoming more federal. It creates new federal institutions, new programs and things like that. So what are the consequences of pandemic? If you look on EU level, very briefly, of course, first of all, what we can predict that health care will become one of EU policies, which was still not the case till now. And that is why really when pandemic hit, we saw everybody, how it was difficult on EU level in Brussels, to find any kind of, joint initiative or joint programs. Everything was very much on national level. Second, what we see on economical side, I remember very well, I can compare how EU was behaving during 2008, 2012 and how EU is behaving now. It's really very dramatical difference, very radical difference. If at that time, back in 2008, especially at the very beginning of the crisis, on a national level, on Lithuanian level, we were struggling how to find where to borrow money, globally. Now the government has a big challenge to find where to spend the money. When the money really is borrowed on EU level, and that is what is some kind of really remarkable change, because EU during the next several years will spend 2% of GDP instead of 1%, what was usually the level of spending of EU. So EU is doubling its budget. Now, of course, part of those money, 750 billion in recovery fund are borrowed on EU level. There are questions who will repay. There are questions, how those money will be spent, how to create this, next generation EU, and not to spend for some kind of populist and daily, issues. But that is exactly what is the outcome of this crisis. And I would say that the EU is going out from that crisis, becoming stronger than it was before the crisis. Now, several remarks on some, comments which both, either in articles or Mrs. Arbatova was speaking. On German leadership, at least, coming from Lithuania, I would say that German leadership in EU is not a problem. It's, lack of the leadership in EU always is a problem. So my answer is very simple. We need Germany in the leadership, real leadership of EU, and we need qualified majority voting even on security and foreign policy, because staying with that liberum veto, right, really makes EU not an effective, institutionally on some major issues connected with security and foreign policy. Also on other issues, even agreement and decision on who will lead Commission without majority voting, I think is really not a very democratic one. What we saw in just last year. Now on security challenges, I do not see any very specific challenges, which are coming out from pandemics. There are some tectonic challenges or global challenges, which we are facing. That is why really in EU we're talking about strategic autonomy, but it would be very wrong, to put it as some kind of alternative towards NATO, and that is what perhaps in some corners of Europe or outside of Europe, maybe in Russia even, there is a misunderstanding. strategic autonomy for Europe is needed in order to stabilize some kind of local conflicts, especially in the south, where there is no possibility to come with some kind of NATO or American presence. But being on European continent and having Russia with all its nuclear power, Europe needs to keep NATO, needs to keep Euro-Atlantic partnership, because only Americans have that power which is needed to balance security on the European continent. All those discussions about Euro-Atlantic crisis or problems, and watching President Trump tweets, and so on, I think it's also misleading. At least in the Baltics, we are not feeling any problems with Euro-Atlantic, relationship. We are happy that we have in Lithuania as a NATO troops Bundeswehr soldiers, and we are happy that Americans are coming to Poland. But that is coming not from so much from EU side, but it's coming exactly as a consequence of some aggressive behavior of Mr. Putin, which we saw during last decade. So when we are looking into those tectonic challenges, for EU, I would say that on one side, of course, we have Russia, and I would say Russia, which is struggling, and I think that it can go into even deeper crisis with what I call post-imperial Russian identity. I don't know how Russia will go out from that, how Russia will become really a modern state. And that is why really what EU can do, even in trying to assist the Russian transformation, is to have much more ambitious Eastern Partnership policy. Success of Ukraine can be very helpful also in that, in showing an example for Russia how to transform itself. Second point is, of course, China. But I would say that, we need to see much longer perspective when we're talking about China. And definitely China deserves, the right to become, global leader from economical point of view during 21st century, if China will continue with such a growth as they have. So they have this potential. And with economical leadership, of course, they will look for some kind of geopolitical leadership. The question for the Western community is very simple. Will that leadership of China will be autocratic or democratic? Not today, not tomorrow, but at the end of the century. And that is where Americans perhaps are trying really to look into that issue much more deeply than we in EU. And that is where some kind of those, what we can call small issues like democracy in Hong Kong is becoming crucial if we are looking into that, into that perspective. So, of course, our wish would be to assist China to move towards democratic development. China has clear evidences, clear arguments, which are saying that democracy is possible for Chinese people. That is Hong Kong and Taiwan. And of course, Chinese global leadership without China becoming, learning how to be democracy would be really a big challenge for the whole world. So that is why even on Chinese questions, I would say that some rhetoric which I hear in EU, that EU will be in between of China and United States, trying to mediate, is, for me, it sounds not a very realistic. We need to be together with US really in preparing the whole world for forthcoming Chinese leadership, global leadership. So those are my comments.
Thank you, Mr. Gavilius. Could I have a straight question back? When you say the US and the EU should be together to prepare for global leadership of economic China, what could that look like?
what to do, or how it can look Chinese leadership on.
Now, what would be together of the EU and the US to prepare for this? What would the preparation for this be?
Well, first of all, I would say, starting from defense of Hong Kong democracy. One thing. Another thing, well, I hope that, at least I'm not a big expert on China, but if you look into Chinese history of last decades, starting from Deng Xiaoping time, China was really showing clear understanding. What does it mean for China to open to the world? And what does it mean for China to come into some kind of, global leadership games? So we need to, I don't know, it's obviously, but we need to discuss that issue, first of all, among us and Americans. I see in some cases, I see the wrong approach. Sometimes it looks like that we in the West, we are trying to not to allow China to become economically global leader. That is a wrong approach. China deserves to become an economical leader. But China needs to understand that if they are pretending to be a global leader with all the autocratic features, then they will face a lot of resistance from the Western community and so on and so on. And if they are prudent enough, they will understand that the world which had, for last several hundred years in the leadership, either Great Britain or United States of America, both of them, with democracy and human rights values. So China, coming into that position of the leadership, needs to understand that for the world, it's really important. Who with what kind of values, who is coming into that leadership?
Thank you. We have been speaking and hearing about Germany a lot. And just a few weeks ago, Angela Merkel gave a speech at Konrad Adenauer Stiftung about Germany's priorities in foreign and security issues during the presidency. And Philip, you were there, and you also were there for the Adenauer conference last week, which is the main conference of the year of Konrad Adenauer Stiftung in Berlin on security and foreign policy issues. So could you please tell us a bit about the priorities that you see in the German presidency that are upcoming?
Yeah, of course. So the conference that we had, where we were so lucky that the Chancellor also gave a few insights on the upcoming priorities of the German EU presidency, President of the EU Council, has had a bit more of a foreign and security policy focus, and the Chancellor, of course, then also focused in her remarks a lot about foreign and security policy. So I want to go into that in a second, but so generally speaking, from what I understand, there are 4 main pillars that the German presidency will entail for the upcoming half of the year, and that first and foremost is coping with the corona crisis, or the long-term effects of the corona crisis. The Chancellor also, when speaking at the Adenauer Foundation a couple of weeks ago, stressed, of course, that now we sort of transition from that early phase that was about the crisis response, when member states helped each other airlifting patients, when it was about medical supplies, etc. And it will now transition, and I think this is also going to be the focus of the German presidency, more on the on bolstering the economic response to the fallout from the crisis. And I want to emphasize here again, because we have been discussing about this before now, and about sort of the German role also in that there is a very strong Franco-German initiative on the table when it comes to coping with the fallout from the crisis in the economic realm. And I think that's going to be one of the driving forces on this first pillar. The second pillar will be negotiations regarding the multi-annual financial framework, which of course is on the agenda. The third, one of the issues we've been discussing a lot over the past years, but that have somehow sometimes evaded public attention a little bit now in the context of the crisis, is of course that there are negotiations about the future relationship with the United Kingdom that are going to shape also the German presidency. So this is the third pillar that the Chancellor announced for the upcoming presidency. And then there's a fourth pillar that sort of comprises a range of different topics. There's a piece on fighting climate change. There's something on reinvigorating the transformation towards more digital Europe. And then thirdly, there's also a focus on sort of strengthening Europe's role in the world. And this is, what pertains a bit more to foreign and security policy, something that the Chancellor spoke about a lot when she was at the foundation a couple of weeks ago. And I would emphasize two things that she focused on her speech there as well. And that is, first of all, when it comes to foreign security policy, priority for the German presidency will be the relationship between the European Union and China, something that is featured quite strongly also in the discussions before today. There are plans to finish an investment treaty with China, but there's also talks on other issues such as climate change, environmental protection. And the Chancellor stressed that, of course, while there are concerns with view to the recent steps in Hong Kong, for instance, and the state of democratic rights and civil rights within China, that she does not think these factors are an argument not to have relations, but rather to engage critically with China, and that's going to be the main focus also for her. And then second, also in that realm of foreign and security policy, she stressed the importance of EU-Africa relations, also something that's going to be a focus. There's an EU-Africa summit in October, I believe, and with view to the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, also the effects of the pandemic on Africa, how this is going to shape relations is going to be a major topic for this focus area.
Thank you, Philip. Paul, I would like to come back to you because you pointed out this dilemma of the multilateralism and of the intergovernmentalism, which was also addressed, I think, by Nadia. We've heard from Mr. Kubilius that the crises of the European Union have been its main defining moments for growth. So do you also see this, that the EU will overcome this gap in competencies in the health care system? And do you think this will strengthen its role also to lead globally into a strategic autonomy? You said that it's not a moment of truth now, but do you think it will reinvigorate its potential? So through solving health issues, become more of a global power.
Mm-hmm. So first, it's the thesis that one comes across, that the EU has kind of gone from crisis to crisis, and it's come out stronger each time. Crises have prompted more integration. I suppose the question for Prime Minister Kubilius is this particular, or certainly since the Eurozone crisis, we've seen a lot, some kind of pushback from populist forces in European member states. And so my question to him there would sort of be to whether or not there's a counterforce that could change things this time round. In terms of multilateralism, you quoted what I said in the paper. So no, I don't see that the EU is going to do that on a global scale. I think perhaps this speaks a little bit to something that Nadezhda Arbatova said, which was that she cited Josip Borrell talking about Europe, the EU talking with a language of force. And this is, there's this idea of a sort of more geopolitical EU. And I think this is very much a case of rhetoric catching up with reality, as I see it. Insofar as if this means less emphasis on values, and I think that is what it means, even if officials in Brussels can't say that, then we kind of already have that. When I look at something like, my go-to example would be the lifting of sanctions on Belarus in 2016. I think this, was driven more by geopolitical considerations than anything kind of liberal institutional. And if the EU is moving in that direction, and I'm right, then that creates two problems for the EU. One is a problem of how it can contribute more to multilateralism if it's moving away from some of those values on which it's pinned. And secondly, the EU has very much tied its identity to values of democracy and human rights, which are embedded in these institutions. If it starts downplaying those values, this may undermine the cohesion that the EU has insofar as it can be an actor internationally. So the question then becomes what's going to gel the EU together. I thought if I can respond to just one of the comments that Dr. Arbatova made. She made this quite striking observation about Germany and France changing places on intergovernmentalism and supranationalism. And I suppose the question becomes, why is that? And if we think back to the Cold War era when we had France and West Germany, France was clearly the more powerful state, and by pushing for a sort of intergovernmental foreign or security policy for Western Europe, it would be a way to realise its own power. Whereas now, France may feel a little more that focusing on supranationalism is a way to control or to constrain slightly Germany's power, whereas Germany will see it perhaps the other way round. So I guess I'm a realist at heart, is what this comes down to. So I have doubts.
Okay, thank you. You've also asked questions to Mr. Kubilius and both Mr. Kubilius and Nadia. I would like to pass that on to Nadia first. The question whether values have become less important, maybe pegged to the question to you as somebody who's observing the EU from a Russian perspective. Do you think the EU is looking for a way to uphold values internally, to make sure all the member states follow those values? While at the same time, when becoming a global power, you have to take countries as they are, first of all, and engage with them, rather than making values a precondition to engagement. So do you see this as a contradiction or as something which is part of growing up globally? To Nadia, the question.
Я хотела бы сказать, что
I would like to say that I don't see any contradiction here. The European Union needs to learn how to speak the language of force to protect their own values and norms. And I can focus your attention on such an interesting fact when, in spite of the United States, Russia, and China having very difficult relations with each other, still they do not accept the European. Unfortunately, the connection is off with Dr. Arbatova.
So we wait for a few more seconds, but she was gone before and we didn't see whether this was a technical problem. So since Nadia seems to be gone for the moment, maybe we could shift the question to Mr. Kubilius, who was also addressed, and maybe even picking up from this. So do you think this is even a prerequisite to be able to speak with the language of power, of force, to defend your own values? Also the question, please switch on the microphone.
Ну, частично я согласен с госпожой Арбатовой. Очевидно, что Евросоюз должен иметь язык силы, автономной силы, может быть, для того, чтобы защищать собственные ценности и в некоторых случаях, может быть, стать, чтобы не дестабилизировать ситуацию. Мы не можем просто смотреть как сторонний наблюдатель, когда буквально на заднем дворе Европы происходят какие-то конфликты. Поэтому я не вижу здесь каких-то противоречий. К сожалению, Евросоюз на данный момент пока еще не имеет такую реальной силы, и мы лишь наблюдаем, каким образом
Turkey is coming with their power, and pushing, pushing Russians from Libya, for example. So I think that yes, EU needs to have some capacity, limited one. I do not imagine that EU would be able to compete with Russia or Americans, or even Chinese on nuclear power capabilities. But to have some kind of, real capabilities, very targeted. That's really what is needed. I got also the question on, if I can elaborate a little bit.
Could I just have a follow-up question on this?
Yeah.
So the question, you said that the crisis is the inspiring moment to move on, but do you think that moving on now on health issues is going to be the driving force of this moment where the EU actually finds the power to overcome national egoisms to also move forward on this hard force side to address these issues that you mentioned? So is the health crisis something that will bring us forward to come together for security, hard security?
No. I do not believe. As we see from previous experiences, usually EU is consolidating its institutions and capabilities and new functions only in that area where the crisis hit the whole EU. So from that point of view, since we had no policy on EU level on healthcare, I think that now we shall have a change on healthcare. Yes, we also this crisis, because of its economical consequences, were quite difficult to predict. So EU also created some kind of new instruments to fight against economical crisis, like this, as I said, 2% spending is something totally new, and it can be something which will have a historical significance. So that's but it will not affect so directly anything like security.
But if the EU can only move forward in the areas where the crisis hits to have more integration, would that logically mean that we need a major security crisis to move on and forward in security terms, like the Second World War almost led to the European Defense Union? Which
it's in some way, yes. Maybe I can. Well, I would hope that EU would be able to see that we are in some kind of really security, deterioration around Europe, and that it should push Europe towards becoming stronger on security and foreign policy issues. Besides that, I think that we are coming also to what I can call challenge on the management of EU. And again, I can repeat what I have said before. I think that without qualified majority voting in all the different areas, including security, EU will become totally ineffective. I just can remind you that Rzeczpospolita, Polish and Lithuanian Union collapsed, simply because of liberum veto, because there was a demand to have on all the major decisions consensus, and that killed the whole huge state. So that is what the EU can learn from our painful history.
Thank you. I would like to move again to the issues of the neighborhood. So we've seen, for example, Alexander pointed this out in his paper, that the question still remains the that the EU should have a strong stance toward the Western Balkans. He also alluded to the Eastern Partnership. We've spoken about Russia since. And in this, the paper that the High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy put forward in March, when Corona was already underway, 5 areas were pointed out, which is economy, the rule of law and security, climate, a digital transformation, and fair and inclusive societies. So these 5 points as main focuses of the Eastern Partnership Program. Do you think, still talking to you, Mr. Gabilis, that these priorities have changed ever since, or is the Corona pandemic having an impact on this?
No, perhaps Corona did not change too much, EU policy towards Eastern Partnership, which I am not satisfied very much, and still we're looking for more ambitious, Eastern Partnership policy, because we can see very clearly one striking difference. When EU is talking about Western Balkans, of course, EU is talking about membership perspective, and so one reason why EU is giving membership perspective for Western Balkans is very clearly announced, many times by Ursula von der Leyen, by Joseph Borrell, by other leaders, with a very clear sentence that if EU is not going into that region, if EU is not integrating that region into giving them membership, then first of all Russia, or after that maybe China, are coming and destabilizing the whole region. So that is very clear, and I agree absolutely 120% with that language. But that language is not repeated towards Eastern Partnership region. And that is, as I say, striking difference, which I understand why. The difference in between of Eastern Partnership and Western Balkans is not in their readiness towards integration. Michael Emerson from CEPS, from Brussels think tank, in 2018 made very interesting report and he compared Eastern Partnership countries, and Western Balkan countries individually in their readiness towards integration into EU. And his conclusion was, he compared all the different factors and criteria and so on and so on. And his conclusion was that at that time, Georgia was better prepared than any other country from Western Balkans or Eastern Partnership countries. So the difference is not in the readiness, the difference is in the distance towards Moscow. And that means that still EU is allowing Moscow to have some kind of red lines, which I think are really a bad policy choice, because it does not help, of course, Eastern Partnership countries, and it does not help Russia itself. As I said before, really Eastern Partnership development and creation of successful belt of successful countries would be very helpful to Russia itself. So that's what we see as really priority line. Of course, we understand that to achieve such a change in EU attitude is not so easy. It will not happen during one day. We had no naive dreams that this web conference of Eastern Partnership or web Eastern Partnership Summit will change anything, but we are working on developing some kind of much more clear strategy how we need to work in Euronest with other enthusiasts of Eastern Partnership, how we can, what job we need to do in order that during the next decade, till 2030, at least the most advanced Eastern Partnership countries, what we call TRIO, Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, would be allowed to come to the beginning of Western Balkans road.
Thank you, and welcome back, Nadia. You were cut short by some technical issues.
I don't know what has happened.
Most important thing is you're back.
Yeah.
Would you like to finish the comment that you started when you were cut out?
Yes, let me switch to Russian. Я хотела сказать, что
I would like to say that, to rather repeat the main driving idea that the EU must learn the language or policy of force to protect its own values on the international arena. And there are 3 different models of force superpowers. United States and China, one type of force, they're full-fledged centers of force. Russia and the EU are two different types of force. Russia is a military center of force. The EU is an economic center of force. So EU needs a strategic autonomy to occupy a well-deserved place among the modern centers of force. And there is no contradiction, the way I see it. If the world is moving away from the multilateral cooperation to the policy of force, then the EU must learn and must abandon its well-intended view of the world, which has existed for quite a while, and must learn how to do the real politics. As for, I'm being quick because I'm afraid of the connection going down again. As far as the Eastern policy is concerned, just a couple of comments. Eastern policy was a trigger of confrontation between Russia and the EU, because Russia was not included into the Eastern Partnership countries. And for Russia, whatever is done without Russia is deemed to be against it. I believe that to take examples from the Eastern Partnership countries for Russia would be unrealistic. The thing is different. Ms. Merkel, when she spoke about the German presidency program, clearly formulated the attitude of the EU to the main centers of force. She said that the United States is important to Europe, is as important as Europe is important for the United States. A correct approach, equal relation to each other. As far as Russia is concerned, she said that it will be a peaceful coexistence and selective cooperation. I was surprised by a different thing. She didn't clearly voice the attitude of Germany and the EU to China. There was some pro-Chinese deviation in her speech, and herein lies a danger both for Germany and the EU. It's clear that China is a very important economic partner of the EU, but the economic thinking or pragmatism is not always a good advice giver in the global politics. We know this from our past. For the EU, it is important to find a correct place vis-a-vis China, United States, and Russia. I do not really believe that the EU and United States can develop a joint shared position towards China, because this is exactly where they don't see eye to eye. As for Mr. Kubilius's comments on the positive attitude of Mr. Trump's comments, it's all clear, but we shouldn't forget how it was done vis-a-vis Germany. Trump, I believe, is acting like a divide and conquer. His lack of satisfaction with Germany is manifested like this. As for this particular decision, I believe that it's quite provocative. Of course, it's going to cause some reaction from Russia, and most importantly, how it was done. If Trump wanted to do this, he should have negotiated it with Putin and say that, for instance, we are concerned with this and that. It would be great if you could do this and that. There was no negotiation, neither with Russia nor with Germany. And that's, again, we're coming back to the Euro-Atlantic relations. Merkel was right when she said that the equal relations, where their interests coincide, we're going to cooperate. Of course, anything can change in Washington, D.C., but I'm confident that even if a new president comes to power, Europe is not going to return back to its list of priorities. And the United States is looking at Europe as an instrument, or rather a resource, that the United States can use when they can in leveraging their relations with other superpowers. As for Russia, yes, perhaps now the peaceful coexistence is not the best we can remember from the immediate past, but now is the only possible solution. While Russia itself does not decide what model of development to choose or decide its own future, where it's going to move in the future, whether it's going to move down the big Eurasia path or it's going to realize its pro-European roots. I firmly believe that Russia is a European country with a huge territory beyond the Ural Mountains with a very tragic history, which many times moved Russia away from the European path. I'm an optimist, and I believe that sooner or later, Russia is going to return back to the European path. It's going to realize its European identity, because the chief criterion for identity is the culture.
Thank you. I would like to come back to Philip shortly, but first of all, I would like to encourage all of you who are watching this, be it on Zoom or on our Facebook page, to ask your questions into the chat, either in the Facebook chat or in the chat on Zoom if you're with us on Zoom, or, which would be even the best solution, into the Q&A function within Zoom. But Philip, you are now the coordinator for transatlantic relations. And we've been hearing a lot about this term resilience, which is not only the prism through which all of these 5 priorities in the Eastern Partnership have been presented, but also in this letter that was quoted by Alexander, this letter written by the Ministers of Defense of Germany, France, I believe Italy and Spain. The first point in this path towards a defense Europe, how it is coined, is again solidarity and resilience. So is this term rather passive? You don't want to be shaken by something else. And what does it say about the ambition of the European Union in this concept of defense Europe in a transatlantic perspective?
Well, I think it is passive. Maybe passive is the wrong word, though, but it's certainly reactionary to the extent that, of course, NATO is a defense alliance, and therefore, you know, the ultimate objective, of course, of implementing resilience within the alliance is to shield and to protect member states from threats, from external threats, but, you know, also from new, maybe non-classical security threats, as we've seen with regards to COVID-19. So in this regard, yes, it is passive, but I think it stems from a realization, nevertheless, that there is a great deal of proactiveness required in these measures. So I think it was you, Dr. Hansberry, you mentioned that last week during the NATO panel, you were quite interested in hearing that NATO has drawn up plans for a second wave of COVID-19 and that it's planning for that scenario. So I think when, you know, looking at that example, for instance, improving resilience within the alliance means very well proactively and you know, taking up initiative in coping with these fast-moving crises and emergencies. And I think in this regard, you know, quoting it as being passive maybe creates somehow of a false impression that it's sluggishly and, you know, slowly responding to things that are coming up. I think what the alliance is very much trying to aim at here is becoming more proactive and becoming quicker in responding to threats that challenge its member states.
Okay, thank you. One last individual question to Paul. You were very skeptical in the beginning of Europe's strategic role. Has that changed now during this discussion? And now the precise question is that you say in your paper, it would be a mistake to exaggerate the European Union's agency in determining parameters of the new world order, but it would also be a mistake to underrate its ability to shape the details. So what do you think, what kind of details could be decisive that the European Union might still have an influence on?
Well, on the first question, no.
It's a very British thing to say.
On the details, so I pointed in the paper, there was a link to a scholarly article which talks about the EU's power to transfer its regulations its regulatory framework, whether that be health and safety standards and such forth, up to the global level, up to global institutions. So I do think that if the EU member states can agree on their preferences, they can use their economic power to make kind of, well, perhaps in a sort of, I suppose it's called log rolling, use that power to sort of make side bargains in other areas and try to get values and norms that the EU wants to see adopted at a global scale adopted. Now, if the balance of power is shifting towards China, then it's about using what leverage we have in negotiation. The EU has, sorry, I said we, I'm now outside the EU. The EU using what power it has in those negotiations to try to shape China's preferences. I suppose it's a sort of soft power idea, which can then, then you get China advocating for those on a wider scale. The big problem comes back to, a big problem here comes back to the transatlantic aspect of EU foreign and security policy, which is that if the US is pulling in a different direction, which it may do if Donald Trump gets to serve a second term, then the EU is limited in, it won't want to, can't really burn its bridges with the US, because ultimately the US is the guarantor of against any existential threat to the European Union, well, to a NATO member state, which, as we know, often means an EU member state.
Thank you. So this means that I would like to come to the final question, which is a question that we always ask on this format, which is your recommendations of each of the panelists to Eastern European region in this time now. After all what we've discussed, what are your recommendations in terms of security policy? What should the countries and societies do to get not only out of the COVID crisis, but through the changes that we will see in the best possible way? And I would suggest we start, ladies first, with Nadja.
Спасибо. Когда идет речь о безопасности,
when we speak about security under such difficult circumstances and under such situation when we don't have any new mechanisms, instead we have only old mechanisms that we inherited from the Cold War era, and such things as the Russian NATO Council. How, under such circumstances, can we avoid this acute problems? How to attempt to de-escalate confrontation? Because peaceful coexistence, as we remember from the Cold War era, came into existence when we managed to regulate our differences of opinion. Now, I believe the situation reminds us of the situation which existed before the Caribbean crisis. It is a very precarious situation. We see that the arms control is deteriorating. Each one is acting in accordance with their own interests. And the only possibility here is not to act like Donald Trump acts, but rather discuss and negotiate all these issues with all other parties by using all potentially available formats, be it the format of the Baltic region, the format of Russian NATO Council. This council is totally paralyzed at the moment, but I still believe that there might be moments in time when interests of security require deep discussions and immediate discussions without waiting for any breakthroughs. So we need to attempt to discuss these problems openly, both with the countries of New Europe, with Baltic countries, which of course are very much concerned with what is happening in Kaliningrad, that Kaliningrad is having its military buildup. But Russia, in turn, is also concerned, because if we speak about the general balance between NATO and Russia, it's not in favor of Russia. There is some kind of asymmetry which can be resolved only in the format of a dialogue. Any unilateral actions like the ones done by Trump are counterproductive without waiting for the reaction from Russia, which will invariably lead to escalation of the situation. Now we need to approach a moment in time when we can be talking about peaceful coexistence. That's it. Thank you very much.
Well, my recommendations for both sides, both for Eastern countries and for Europe. For Europe, my recommendation is really to try to achieve that level of understanding of security issues like Americans have. If to read American, government administration national security strategy from 2017, they are naming in a very clear way what are the biggest challenges for their security globally, and they're answering in a very simple way with very simple language. On one side, aggressive Russia with all the nuclear capabilities. From another side, rising power of China. And Americans are trying to react to those challenges for their security. In Europe, we're talking about strategic autonomy and things like that, which are important, but we are very bad in really saying very clearly from where security challenges are coming to Europe, and that is why sometimes we are in confusion. Unfortunately, for time being, security challenges to Europe are coming again from aggressive Russia. And we can talk that NATO, is developing their capabilities somewhere closer to the borders of Russia, but that is an answer to actions which were done by Putin. And unfortunately, only Russia and only Kremlin during the last decades were grabbing territories outside of the borders of Russia, and that is what we can hear again from Putin's recent speeches. Now, I don't know if you were able to follow his remarks on TV, where he said that Soviet Union collapsed in an illegal way. Countries left Soviet Union in an illegal way. Some countries left Soviet Union with big territorial gifts from Russian people, which means that maybe, as we understood, that is a promise that those gifts will be taken back. And at least experts from Russia on TV, they are speaking about Belarus and Kazakhstan, who got those gifts back in 1990s. So what's a choice for Eastern Europeans? Choice is very simple. Like people in Belarus are trying to do the choice to go for change and to look where is more of security, and security comes with prosperity, and prosperity comes with closer integration with EU. That is my very simple, answer.
Thank you. When it comes to gifts, we have a saying in German that taking back a present means stealing it. You, as Lithuanians, remember how big Lithuania once was. And
yeah.
The city of Smolensk was founded by Belarusians. So
yeah.
I think history is always only half good in terms of justifying territorial claims. But this is not the issue now. I would like to go over to Paul for your recommendations.
Mm-hmm. We used to talk of the Eastern Partnership states as being the in-betweeners, in between the EU and Russia. Perhaps to some extent now, all of us in Europe, including Russia, if it does indeed return to a European path, are now in-betweeners. And so maybe the EU can learn something from the Eastern Partnership states. I think, look, if I were watching the recent situation from one of those Eastern Partner states, I'd be concerned about the way that China has managed successfully to hector the EU in a couple of very specific instances. One was there was a open letter that EU ambassadors signed to the China Daily newspaper, where they were persuaded to remove references to the coronavirus pandemic originating in China. And the second one was the EU's recent disinformation report, which I believe was adapted in response to criticism from Chinese officials. So if I were looking at the EU from an Eastern Partnership state, I'd be recognizing that the EU is kind of finding itself stuck in a very difficult position too. And so the recommendation is simply to try to support each other and work together as best we can. I'm assuming when you say the East European region that you're referring to states outside of the EU, but it doesn't really change the recommendation. It's just to work together.
Thank you. Philip, your final recommendations.
Yes, I would very much like to agree with and sort of maybe expand a little bit on what Dr. Arbatova has said at the very beginning. I think my main recommendation would focus on the fact that there is a very intricate security structure in place that has shaped the European peace and security order for many decades now, and I think that is under pressure, under attack at the moment. It's been undermined from different sides, and we see it eroding. And I think trying to halt that process and reverse it has to be paramount objective for all European countries, really, in the end, because I think the level of stability, of transparency, of predictability that it creates is inherent to peace and stability in Europe. However, maybe going a little bit further on what Dr. Arbatova has said, I think it's certainly not enough to look at that structure and trying to sort of prolong it, even though we see many instances where some of the treaties have been undermined and not observed by some parties, and also other areas where we talk a lot about maintaining platforms of dialogue and of communication, but then when it comes to the question, what do we fill that dialogue with, and what are actually the topics we can productively engage with on, and where we can also sort of go into the future, find innovative solutions, then sometimes we lack a bit of an idea in this regard. So I think this structure also has to be filled with new initiatives and with new ideas. And I think from all the sides, the expectations that I would have is to come up with these innovative ideas to push that structure further, because I think it's really the best thing that we have and something we need to ensure still exists also in the future. Thank you.
Thank you to the four of you for a wonderful and very insightful and exciting discussion. It was a big pleasure moderating you. I'm sorry for a bit being over the time. I again would like to recommend to all of you who have read them the two papers of our experts who can be found online. And I now hand it over to Yohini for the summary.
Thank you very much, Jakob and the panel. It's been a terrific discussion, and as always, it's a great pity time flies so quickly and we cannot continue. Since we're already over time, let me be very brief on making some summary points. So I think when we started talking about the strategic dilemmas, Dr. Arbatova made an important point that we first need to understand the strategic goals of the EU. And there was a lot of talk, of course, about the strategic autonomy, and the other speakers also referred to it and sort of expressed some attitude to the very concept. But then the practical question is whether it can be achieved through an intergovernmental mode, which seems to dominate for the time being. We spent quite some time talking about the role of Germany and whether it can or should or want to transform its economic might into something which will be of serious impact for the EU's global standing. We also talked a lot about what was coined by Dr. Arbatova as the solidarity dilemma, and how nationalism and national interest can work together with the common interest and with this common vision of the EU for itself and for the world. We also spoke a lot about all sorts of opportunities. Prime Minister Kubilius made this very important point that unlike the 2008 crisis, when the EU faced the problem of where to get the money from, now the problem is how to spend it, and that being a problem is also a huge opportunity. Another opportunity is geopolitical, and we've had quite some discussion and some disagreement whether the EU can be this balancing power between China and the China and the United States. And finally, I think it was Paul Hansbury who said that if the EU wants to become more geopolitical, there seems to be a dilemma about how it can do that without damaging its aspiration for promoting multilateralism and also its values-based identity and image. At the same time, both Prime Minister Kubilius, Dr. Arbatova, and I also think Philip said that they don't really see a big contradiction between values and geopolitical aspirations of the EU. And as Dr. Arbatova puts it, the EU needs to learn to promote its interests and values by means of power, at least as long as this power relationship is developing and shaping global relations. And I think I'll stop at this, even though there is loads of other interesting material we've covered and lots of recommendations that were provided. So thank you very much once again, Dr. Arbatova, Prime Minister Kubilius, Dr. Hansbury, and Mr. Dinsbeer. And of course, Jakob, thanks a lot for the wonderful moderation. Thanks to all our interpreters. I know, at least I've, as always, complicated your life by speaking too fast. But as always, you did a great job. And thank you very much for all those who have watched us. It's been a pleasure. And we are continuing. And I think next week, we have the Collective Security Treaty Organization on agenda, and also a new fantastic panel with great speakers. Thank you very much and have a great evening.